So America is full of entitlement programs, and it seems like both parties, Democrats and Republicans, want to increase those entitlements. And the question is, who pays for them? How do those entitlements get paid for? Is it truly a matter of, let's take from the very rich, the billionaires? Can we just get the billionaires to pay for these entitlements, or who actually pays for the entitlements? And today on the Wealthability Show, we have an expert in this, Chris Pope, who's from the Manhattan Institute, a senior fellow. And it is great having a true expert on entitlement programs to talk through the facts about entitlements and not so much the drama and the emotion. We know there's a lot of that. There's a lot of politics through, politicking. Nobody wants to say, I'm going to take away your entitlement, because that's the whole point. It's an entitlement. You're entitled to it. So therefore, but is there a way to deal with these entitlements that is maybe a better way to do it? So we're going to look at that and really get an idea of how does this affect your taxes, because entitlements aren't free. So Chris, welcome to the Wealthability Show.
Hi, Tom. It's great to speak with you today.
So if you could give us a little of your background and how you started really focusing on entitlements for your research.
Well, so I'm primarily a scholar of healthcare policy, but most of the entitlements are healthcare entitlements. The two really big entitlement programs, so certainly two of the big three, are Medicare and Medicaid, the third one being Social Security. And so when you think about entitlements and when you think about healthcare, it's a highly overlapping debate. It's very hard to talk about healthcare without talking about entitlements, and it's very hard to talk about entitlements without talking about healthcare. So it's a big part of the debate. It's not the whole debate, but it's the elephant in the room.
So let's start with that big picture. You've maintained that first of all, the entitlements actually lower the standard of living for the working class. Can you explain what do you mean by that? I mean, that's a pretty strong statement.
So it's for working age adults. Most people, I think, have this view of entitlements as redistributing from rich to poor. And some of them definitely do that. Like we have programs like Medicaid, some programs like TANF, like the traditional welfare programs. But the traditional welfare programs are pretty small. The really, really big entitlement programs are Medicare and Social Security. Um, and those are programs which don't really redistribute from rich to poor so much. They redistribute mostly from workers to retirees. And so that is the main factor of what our welfare state is trying to do. These programs were set up quite reasonably with the idea that when people are retired, they don't know how long they're going to live. They don't know how much money they're going to be able to put aside for, are they going to live for another 10 years, another 20 years, another 30 or 40 years when they retire? And so these programs kind of absorb the healthcare costs and the basically income costs, the income need for a retirement income. It sort of provides that. And so the thought was when people drop out of the labor force, their income is much lower. And these programs basically were designed to allow them to have a standard of living that was closer to what it would have been during their working years. The problem is we've overdone it. And so the size of Social Security and Medicare is now such that it's leaving working people worse off than retirees. And that's really kind of gone to such a great extreme. And the programs were never designed to be this big. They've just metastasized over time and grown steadily over time.
So let me ask you, I'm an accountant, so let me ask you an accounting question. Does the average worker pay for their retirement benefits that they get out of the system, or would they be, because that's a big debate, right? Could I instead just put aside, instead of putting it into Social Security, what if I had that money and actually, but was required to, because people won't do it unless you require them, but was required to set that aside and it was actually invested as opposed to put into the government, would it pay for the benefits that they receive?
So Social Security and Medicare are both pay-as-you-go programs. So the essence of the program is that every generation of workers pays for the previous generation of workers. So today's workers pay for the retirees who worked a generation or two ago. Um, that works okay if the population is stable. The problem is people are living longer into retirement, people are having fewer kids. And so the ratio of workers to retirees is declining over time. And so what's happening is every worker, when they're paying in for Social Security and Medicare, they're having to pay for more retirees than their own coverage. And so every worker is essentially going to get less back from the program than they paid in because the demographics are shifting over time.
Well, so let me ask you about that. Because I've been in the tax business for about 45 years. During that time, the basic Social Security Medicare rate has been 15.3% for my entire working lifetime.
Right.
So how is it changed? I mean, how are they paying for that? Um, is it because the income taxes don't seem to have went, from my perspective, don't really seem to have gone up. And in fact, there are more people that don't pay any income tax pretty
Right.
much than we've had in a very long time. And so the rates are the same. How are they paying more? Is it just because of inflation that they've got an inflationary wage, so they're paying that 15.3% on more money, or what
Right.
is it?
Well, I mean, it's coming out of general federal funds. So it's coming out of two places. One, we've substantially reduced defense spending over the past couple of generations. And the main answer is simply that we're increasing the budget deficit. The federal budget deficit is paying for it. And so the rising national debt is ultimately where the money is coming from. That doesn't really work forever, though. At some point, the investors are going to have a crisis of confidence in lending money to the federal government, and they're going to want to think, well, when are we going to get paid back? Is the federal government going to be able to pay us back to the extent we're going to expect to pay back? And we've seen interest rates starting to increase in what the federal government is having to pay back every year, and so that itself, the burden of uh, interest payments on the federal debt is growing very rapidly to become itself one of the largest elements on the federal budget.
So one of the so of course the first question that most people ask is, are we going to run out of money? Because you're right. I mean, it does go in the general fund. People think, we've got the Social Security Trust Fund, but that's an accounting ledger, right? It's not a separate pool of money.
Right.
It's an accounting ledger, but it does actually exist as an accounting ledger, and it's required accounting ledger. And we have not too many years because of this population challenge that you're talking about. Although I understand that the millennials now are a bigger population than the baby boomers. So but we do have a declining population. So if that's the case, then are we going to hit that mark? And what's going to happen when it automatically cuts to 85% of the benefits? Do you see that happening? Or is
Yeah.
there some way to fund that other than just increase the deficit?
So it's already been the case for a number of years that the amount of money that the Social Security program is paying out every year exceeds the amount of revenue that it raises in payroll taxes every year. So the system's already running a deficit, and that deficit's growing wider every year. Um, when people talk about the Social Security Trust Fund going bankrupt, which I think is in 2034, so about a decade
Right.
away, that basically means that the accumulated surplus of previous years
Right.
is going to match the accumulated deficit, which by itself actually is not that important because it's not like the accumulated money has been saved up. The
Right.
federal government's just spend that money on other stuff. It's really a bit of an accounting fiction. The key thing is that for at least a decade, we've already been running a deficit every year that's growing wider. And we're ultimately going to have to we're ultimately going to have to find a way to to close the gap between revenues in the Social Security program and expenditures, or basically give up on the fiction that this is a program that's paid for. Ultimately, I think that's probably the healthier thing to do. The benefits are set at somewhat arbitrary levels. Like the amount that people get in benefits is not really related to their contributions, other than in a very roundabout and imprecise way, and that doesn't really correlate. The appropriate thing to do would just be to bring the benefits in line with contributions and think like what actually makes sense, what's sustainable and what's affordable.
So one of the things that President Biden has talked about, and Vice President Harris in her campaign recently has basically adopted Biden's budget, and as her tax position, is to actually eliminate the cap on Social Security. It's already been eliminated on Medicare. So
Right.
there's no cap on Medicare. And they also want to increase the Medicare the higher income Medicare percentage from 3.8 to 5%. Do you think those are good solutions? Do you think that will solve it if that were done, that you would just take the caps off?
Well, so the Social Security cap is, I think, around $160,000 in income. Um, so what it would basically mean is a 12.4% tax increase
Right.
on incomes above $160,000. Now that's enormous. Now, if you think about the Trump tax cuts, we're talking about like a couple of points reduction. I mean,
Yeah,
like Bush tax.
that's actually double for a lot of people. That's
Yeah.
actually would double their effective tax rate.
Well, at the higher rate, we're probably above 160,000. We're talking about the higher marginal tax rates, but that's still a large amount to swallow. And if you think, like, I live in New York, so I have a state income tax on top of the federal income
Right.
tax. And if I don't live in the city, but people who live in the city, you're already getting close to 50%
Right.
if you had state, federal, and city income taxes. If you then add another 12.4% tax on top of that, you start having some of the highest taxes in the Western world, and you're falling on the wrong side of the Laffer curve with that amount, quite and by almost every estimate. And so you're not actually increasing the revenue. You might even be reducing the revenue that's being generated. So I think that's a campaign slogan. It's not really a serious attempt to plug the financing hole.
Okay. Although potentially that 1.2% increase in the Medicare tax, I don't think that's just a talking point. I think that will actually happen should the Democrats win. Certainly, should they sweep. On top of that, they want to apply it to all income, not just. So now it applies to two types of income. Applies to earned income, and it applies to investment income, but it does not apply to business income. And it would apply to business income under the Biden budget, and it would raise some money. So it seems like that would be one way. Let me turn a little bit though to Medicare now, because I know this is this is really your expert, your focus in your studies. Medicare obviously has blown up in cost, especially since George W. Bush, right? And so because of the prescription drugs, right? So that really blew up the cost of Medicare. One of the other big revenue raisers that the Tax Foundation has looked at is not allowing the deductibility or the non-taxability of employer-provided health care. So that would raise about $5 trillion over 10 years. So when you look at funding Medicare, I mean, once it's entitlement, you can't take it away. So how do you think it ought to be funded? Because right now, I mean, the Biden Harris says we're not going to increase taxes on anybody making under 400,000, but that would,
Right.
if you're going to pay for it, you're clearly going to increase taxes. I mean, if you lifted the if you lifted the cap, although they're talking about putting a donut hole in there so that you'd only pay that. So the in between 160 and 400, you would pay no more additional Social Security or Medicare tax, but over 400 you would. So what do you think about these proposals, and what would you propose?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the cost of Medicare has basically been increasing steadily since the moment it was established in 1965. And the reason for it is quite simple. It's actually not really to do with the prices, although it probably was in the early years, that Medicare pays, that the prices Medicare pays for healthcare services are actually below the general level of inflation. It's actually not even about demographic change, although that slightly increased the cost of Medicare. The real reason Medicare's cost keeps increasing is that the program basically pays for any new medical service and technology that is developed, regardless of its cost effectiveness. And so if I develop a new drug, that gets layered onto the existing program. If I develop a new surgical technique, that gets layered onto the existing program. If I develop a new medical device, the benefit package automatically expands. And because Medicare is pretty indiscriminate about what it pays for, it basically says, well, even if it's not very effective, we'll pay for it, which tells it basically innovators that if they do something that's only partially effective, that's going to be hugely reimbursed and very generously reimbursed. And so we have this constant bloat of the benefit package with things that are not hugely effective without really any scrutiny, automatically escalating over time.
Hmm.
If you actually slowed that increase of the benefit package over time, these additional new services, or even required Congress to pay for any new services that are added to the benefit package, so take a look at it, think, is this new drug really worth it? Is this new surgical procedure really worth it? Well, we have to find the money from somewhere to pay for it. If you actually had a process like that, that would really deal with most of the Medicare fiscal problem that's coming. And Medicare itself is the largest cause of the federal government's overall fiscal problem. So it's a very big deal, this issue of new services being added to the program without any real scrutiny.
Interesting. Okay, so I want to turn a little bit to the whole discussion of should we provide health care for everybody. So should there be a national health insurance or a national health program like there is, frankly, in most countries? We're kind of the odd man out, especially when you look at our European cousins. They all have national health. So what are your thoughts on that? And would it actually increase costs? Would it decrease costs?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's generally a good thing that we expect people to buy their own insurance to provide for themselves if they can. Um, and that means that, if the demand for healthcare increases, we can accommodate that demand. The money is there for that increased desire for healthcare. And as societies get richer, people want to spend more on healthcare. There's only so much food you can eat.
Right.
There's only so much, you can improve your car. Even people get tired of travel after all, but people really want to spend more on healthcare. And that's a pretty reasonable thing for people to want to do as a society gets richer. And so the ability of private insurance to expand and accommodate this demand for more healthcare and better quality healthcare and new services is generally a very good thing. And I think that's one of the things that we do pretty well, and we shouldn't try and get in the way of that. If you look at a lot of the European countries, what they basically has is they have this government healthcare budget. And there's only so much money that the government can raise in taxes, and they're all pretty much running up against the limit of that. And when that pot of money runs out, they just have to say to people, well, I'm sorry, we're not going to cover your operation, or I'm sorry, there's not enough doctors to look after you if you go to the hospital, or yeah, you're going to have to wait. And if your cancer gets worse, then, I'm sorry, we couldn't afford the drugs to take care of you at the beginning. And so that is a systematic problem with the sort of government finance healthcare systems. What I think we do well is we say, if you can pay for yourself with private insurance, we expect you to do that. If you're a healthy member, if you're sort of a able-bodied working age adult, we expect you to do that. We expect you to provide for your children. And then we have basically government programs that basically fill in the gaps that are left over, like Medicare for when people are retired. We have Medicaid if people are unable to work or low income in certain cases. And we've done a pretty good job of basically focusing the public funds on those patches where people aren't able to provide it for themselves. And that basically is much more effective. It means that we're not rationing across the board. We're allowing the healthcare system to grow and be innovative, but also like able to make sure that we get good value for money and we don't just spend what would essentially be trillions of dollars every year just displacing private funds, crowding out private responsibility.
What do you think of the idea of making it optional so people could opt into Medicare, pay for it, but opt into
Well,
it?
so I mean, the devil is in the details there. The real so I mean, like, what is really special about Medicare that's different from a private insurance plan? And the reality is that Medicare has negotiated special rates from
Right.
hospitals
Mhm.
and physicians that tend to be lower. Um, Now, the thing is, these Medicare has gotten a bulk discount on this because it's basically said the hospitals can charge people in the workforce, people in private insurance more, and Medicare will pay less, and it's gotten this discount. If everyone if everyone was in Medicare, it wouldn't be able to get the same discount because there would be a massive revenue cut to the hospital system as a whole. So you would essentially find hospital revenues reduced by about a third, and hospitals they wouldn't be able to run with the current price discrimination that they're working. Now, is this price discrimination optimal? Probably not. Is this the best way we could do this? No, but there is no free lunch there by just shifting everyone into Medicare. It would basically get rid of the main thing that makes Medicare relatively cheaper, which is this ability to get a discount relative to the people who are in the workforce.
Yeah, I'll give you an example, personal example of that. So I made the mistake once of actually going to get my my blood test done at the hospital where I go for my doctor, and I'm looking at the charge and I'm going, it's $400. I'm going, well, what the insurance paid? Insurance paid $1,000. So literally, the hospital charged $1,400 to do two small tests that had I
Right.
gone to, the local private place and used my insurance there, it would have been almost free. Okay. So they add in all of this overhead into the private, and the private health insurance
Exactly right.
covers
Yeah.
it. And so not a really fair way to do it from my standpoint. So is there a solution to that, or is this just the way it's going to be?
Yeah, I mean the issue of hospital overheads, I think you put your finger on it, is such a big part of it's like the dirty little secret of American healthcare. It's like how to attribute these overhead costs. And everyone wants someone else to basically pick up these overheads. And we've shifted it away from Medicare and we've shifted it away from Medicaid. And it's kind of ended up in private insurance. And but then, people would prefer to people can avoid them in some circumstances by going to independent clinics and sort of seeking care elsewhere. I think the essence of the problem is that we've indirectly accommodated the hospital industry way too much. And we've basically said that the insurers have to pay for everything. And we've basically hampered their ability to negotiate aggressively with hospitals. And so hospitals basically get any expenditure they make covered by insurance, which just drives up the cost. And we're reaching the limits of this strategy. We're really going to have to unwind that a little bit. I think I can talk about this a little more if you'd like, but the essence of like insurance just being unable to negotiate aggressively with hospitals is the root of so much of our problems in rising healthcare costs, and the lack of efficiency in the healthcare system really comes from that.
So, what are your recommendations for getting the whole entitlements particularly the healthcare entitlements, getting the funding for that out of under control, so that in fact, your retiree is living better than your working class American. And even though they may not have put enough funds into that to be to have 20 years of payout, basically, which is really what's happened. In my mind,
Yeah.
what's happened is when Social Security, Medicare first came on, people weren't living very long after they started getting it. Now they
Right.
live 20, 30 years after they get it, and it's just going to get longer. Right.
Right.
And so do we then do, like Social Security, they've kind of bumped it up a little bit, right? From 65 to 66 and a half, 67. They keep bumping that up, or that, which is one way to deal with that.
Right.
Now, they didn't do that with Medicare, but they did it with Social Security. And of course, that's what France did, right? They said, well, we're going to raise the retirement age, and they had millions of people
Right.
demonstrating in the streets. So this is a big deal to people. I mean, you don't even whisper that you're
Yeah.
going to cut Medicare and get elected.
Well, I think the beginning of solving the problem starts with the fact that the status quo is actually not that bad in terms of the imbalance. The problem is the growth path. It's the growth path of spending over time. If it was the current level if we kept Social Security spending at the current level, that would be fine. If we kept Medicare spending at the current level, that would be fine because tax revenues are scheduled to grow over time, just as the economy grows. The problem is that the Social Security benefits are also expected to grow over time. And the Medicare benefits, as I said, because of the addition of new services, they're expected to grow over time even faster. So it's really to rein in the growth path. And I think that's politically a lot easier. Like when you're reforming entitlements, it's extremely hard to take away stuff from people. And that's understandable. People plan their lives around these benefits. When you're planning a retirement, you expect a certain amount of Social Security, you expect a certain healthcare benefit package. That's totally understandable that you don't want to take away from people what they've kind of built their futures on expecting to arrive. But what you can do is you can say, this is the nature of the benefit package that you've been accustomed to. We're just going to stop increasing it so greatly over time. Or the Social Security benefits. We're going to change the way these are indexed over time. We're going to basically say we're going to keep adjusting them for the growth of prices, but they're not going to keep increasing with wage rates, which are growing higher.
So your focus is on containing costs rather than just raising taxes. Taxes are they're a big deal to the average American. If you look at a business owner, let's say they make $100,000. If they're a sole proprietor, they're paying 15.3% Social Security and Medicare on that full $100,000. Of course, we do tax planning so that they don't pay 15.3%. And right now it's very doable, which is something that Biden has actually suggested and Harris have suggested, to eliminate that ability to not pay 15.3% on everything. They want that big tax increase on small business, which it is small business. That it's the small business owner who is not paying it all right now that would get the big tax increase. And it certainly would be less. I have a hard time believing that they're going to be able to do it on just people making over 400,000, because there aren't that many people.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot. I think that's right. I think, as I was saying earlier, it's really hard to take things away from people that they're accustomed to. And I think that's why there's a bit of an asymmetry here between the two reform paths. Just slowing the rate of growth of benefits doesn't take things away from people. Imposing a big new tax on people, that really disrupts their lives. That really you talk about small businesses, that's not just the individuals, it's the communities they're part of as well. They're going to suffer. It's the people getting their services, the people that work for them. You're not just hitting the business owner, you're hitting everyone that depends and works with them.
So what do you say to the two parties that want to increase entitlements? Both parties are running on increased entitlements. JD Vance has said he wants to increase the child tax credit to $5,000.
Right.
Kamala Harris has said she wants to increase it to $3,000, but also give $6,000 for new babies.
Yeah.
What do you say to those politicians outside of how are you going to pay for it?
Oh, that was going to be my answer. How are you going to pay for it really is the question. That's there, and there's no avoiding that. I mean, if that wasn't a problem, there wouldn't really be a debate. I mean, that is the whole discussion.
Do you think the proposals? So the Democrats have a $5 trillion tax increase package, and that would mostly be um, the proposal would take from the higher income and give it to the and really give it to these entitlements for the lower income. Um, do you think that's politically workable in what in your studies? Is that something that it makes sense? Do you take $5 trillion out of? Of course, I have my economics hat on, and I'm going. That makes no sense. Take it from investors and give it to consumers, because all you do is create stagflation when you do that. But outside of that, do you think that that is a viable way to pay for it?
Yeah, I think I find it hard to believe that they even fully believe in it themselves. Like I think everyone kind of knows that that magnitude of a tax increase is just not feasible. I mean, I think like when it comes down to specifics, who is going to face like a tax increase of a certain magnitude? They're just very, very shy about it. If you and this is not just the presidential candidates. On when you actually come down to the rank and file in Congress, Democratic members in suburban swing districts, um, how many of them really want to defend like a $500 tax increase on people? It's actually not that many. Like most politicians really don't like taking things away from people, and a tax increase is it's like the most naked way of taking stuff away from people, right? It's the most painful thing a politician can do. So I think politicians have never really been eager to increase taxes. If you look at American history, the only time taxes have really, really gone up very fast has been during the wars, during World War II, during World War One, when there's kind of the excuse that everyone kind of accepts of, we have a massive military conflict that we need to win, and taxes were pushed way up. And if you actually sort of think, why was the tax burden so high? It's generally been because taxes haven't been reduced after the war as much as they were increased before it. But actually, increasing taxes is something politicians really tend not to like to do in peacetime.
Well, so interesting enough, we have a major party candidate running on increasing taxes. We've actually never had a major party candidate run on increasing taxes and win. But right now she's ahead in the polls.
Yeah.
So has there been a shift? Have the Democrats been able to shift the discussion to say, well, look, taxing the rich, that's a good thing because of course what we all want is to tax somebody else. Right.
Yeah.
That's always the goal. Let's tax somebody else. Well, they have more money. Let's tax them. Let's tax the big corporations because they're making all this money, which is the worst tax increases on corporations because it affects everybody. And that's very well documented. But let's tax somebody else. Do you think do you think it's different this time?
Well, I think you can kind of get away with saying tax increases are the answer if you basically define it in such a sense that no one thinks that you're taxing them. And I think that's you know, a lot of the way that this is, over
Right.
400,000. People feel like, well, that's not me. Um, and but the flip side of that is you basically end up not really being able to point to anyone that you're significantly taxing. And if you think about the incomes over 400,000, you're talking about people who have very heavily capital oriented incomes.
Right.
And as we know, capital is very, very mobile and very, very sensitive to taxes and I mean, very easy to move around and very easy to avoid the tax burden in that way. And so your ability to generate substantial revenue by focusing on a small percentage of the population is generally pretty small. But by focusing on that particular small percentage of the population is probably even less because they have much greater ability to shift their income or to kind of shift it into less taxable areas. And so I find it hard to believe that they're actually going to get very much revenue if they were taking this seriously. I don't think it's really intended as a serious policy proposal. And if you actually sort of look at, I think the flip side of this is that if you look at the history of entitlements over the past half century or so, Congress is constantly cutting Medicare. It's constantly pruning Medicare, cutting payments for various services, trimming the nature of benefits, like adding various qualifications, altering what's covered, um, changing payment systems, everything quietly under the hood in a bipartisan manner. And it's cut hundreds of billions of dollars out of the Medicare program over time, but it doesn't talk about it. Democrats don't like to talk about it unless they can blame it on Republicans. Republicans don't like to boast about it because they don't want to scare seniors. But pretty often you get massive bipartisan budget legislation, and it tends to be focused by these pretty sensible reforms to Medicare. Just no one ever really boasts about it, so people don't realize that it's going on. I'd expect that you would find more of that going on, especially as so much of the increasing costs of entitlements come out of Medicare, comes out of Medicaid and other healthcare programs. That we'll find that actually, you know what? If members of Congress are forced to choose between raising everybody's taxes by thousands of dollars every year and just slowing the rate of growth of entitlements, they're going to find ways to slow the rate of growth in entitlements that people don't even notice because people weren't accustomed to the fact that entitlements were any different to what they were used to in the past.
Well, on top of that, you have the challenge that, when the 16th Amendment was passed and we got the income tax, it only applied to the very wealthiest Americans and only at a very small rate. And now it applies to more than 50% of Americans at much higher rates. And so the idea that, that's the camel's nose in the tent, right? Once you get this idea out and you keep proposing it, once you get, let's say you get a wealth tax on people with $100 million or more, that then becomes, 10 million, and then it becomes 1 million. And then it's just a wealth tax, right? And
Yeah.
it may be narrowed for practical considerations to capital gains on, on marketable securities and not on your home and not on your business. But there is, excuse me, there's always that aspect of it is a slippery slope, and we have to be careful. So this has been a great discussion, Chris. Can you do two things for us? First of all, final words and any recommendations for what an average entrepreneur or business person ought to be looking for and paying attention to in this area, and then let us know where to find more about you and your work.
Yeah. So well, I think that the main thing here is really just to realize how big Social Security and Medicare are compared to every other program. Um, like I think it's something like 95% of seniors get Social Security and Medicare. Um, Less than 5% of working adults get any other welfare program, and the benefits are much larger uh, for for um, for Social Security, especially than any cash benefit program that working age adults are getting. So it's not even close. The fiscal, whenever there are reasons to worry about entitlements for working age adults, probably for work incentive reasons and cultural reasons that are completely legitimate. But when we're talking about the fiscal burden, it's the retirement programs really that are driving it. Now, what entrepreneurs need to think about, I mean, I'm afraid they're probably going to have to just react to what Congress does. Uh, like
Yep.
they're kind of caught in the crossfire, and Congress is going to be looking for money. But ultimately, entrepreneurs have got a pretty good case to make back to Congress, and members of Congress are going to recognize this. If there's talk of a wealth tax, they can make the argument that capital goes where it's appreciated. Um, and does this country want to be the home of where the world parks its investment money, or does it not? I think the United States does really well out of the fact that people right around the world think, where is the place that when I invest my money, I'm going to get a good return on it? The government's not going to take most of it. It's going to generate a good, strong return. That is a massive asset. And I think everyone deep down kind of understands that about the United States and understands that about tax policy. So,
So, Chris Pope, at the Manhattan Institute. What's the best place to go to get find out more about your studies and your research?
I think you can just Google my name, Chris Pope, at the Manhattan Institute, and you should be able to find my website, which has all the articles that I write on a
Awesome.
fairly regular basis.
Thanks so much, Chris. This has been a really fascinating discussion. Remember, we have to pay attention to these bigger issues because they always end up in taxes, and they always end up in the money's got to come from somewhere. This is something I'm not quite sure either political party quite understands, but you cannot run those deficits forever. It's got to come from somewhere, and it's either going to come through inflation. That's one way to pay down the deficit. It's through inflation, which is a horrible tax, actually the worst tax we have because it's the most regressive tax. Or it's going to come from tax increases. I mean, those are the two places it can come from by understanding what's going on, by paying attention, and there is planning you can do. Just remember that you'll always make way more money and pay way less tax when you're watching programs like this. So please subscribe. Please click like below and share it with your friends because we want to get this information out so that everybody can make way more money and pay way less tax. We'll see you next time.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.